Putin just stood in front of his own economists and accidentally confessed to something the Kremlin has spent years hiding, not through a leak, not through a whistleblower, through his own mouth. And what he revealed tells us that Russia is not just struggling. It is entering a financial collapse that experts say could take a century to reverse. Stay with us because the details of what's happening inside Russia right now are more alarming than anything you've heard before. Vladimir Putin recently held a meeting on economic issues and announced something that should have triggered international headlines. Statistics show that economic growth has unfortunately been declining for 2 months in a row, he said. GDP contracted 1.8% between January and February. Manufacturing suffered. Construction suffered. Industrial production suffered. And Putin said all of this as though he had absolutely nothing to do with it. That level of detachment from reality would almost be impressive if it weren't so dangerous. If you're watching this for the first time and want daily breakdowns of how this war is reshaping the world, hit subscribe right now. We cover this every single day. Now, here's what Putin conveniently left out of that meeting. Russia's GDP only grew 1% across all of 2025. That came after 2 consecutive years of growth above 4%. The economy was already slowing before this contraction hit. So when Putin frames a 1.8% GDP drop as a minor blip, he is describing a wound on a body that was already bleeding. And it gets worse. Russia's central bank is forecasting 1.6% growth for the first quarter of 2026. But the Russian Academy of Sciences is projecting a year-on-year decline of 1.5% for that same period. 2 official Russian institutions, completely opposite conclusions. Someone is massaging the numbers, and you already know who has the most to gain from rosier figures. Putin also tried to blame the calendar. Seriously. He pointed out that January had 2 fewer working days than last year, and February had 1 fewer. 3 lost working days caused a 1.8% GDP contraction. That was his argument. Meanwhile, the UK recorded 0.1% growth in January and 0.5% in February. Japan, the US, and the G7 as a whole are posting growth between 0.1 and 0.3%. None of them were gifted extra working days. Russia lost ground while the rest of the world moved forward. If you want to understand exactly why that gap is only going to grow, keep watching, because what's happening inside Russia's industrial sector right now is something most analysts haven't connected yet. Then Putin pointed to Russia's unemployment rate of 2.1% as a sign of strength. And on paper, that sounds impressive. But economist Valentin Katasanov says that figure excludes anyone who hasn't formally registered as unemployed. It also excludes workers whose hours have been slashed or who have been placed on standby by companies with no work to give them. When you account for those people, the real unemployment figure likely doubles. But here's the twist that Putin really doesn't want you to focus on. A low unemployment rate in Russia right now isn't a sign of a healthy economy. It's a sign of a labor catastrophe. Ukraine reports that Russia has suffered over 1.3 million casualties since the invasion began. Those are predominantly working-age men, gone from the economy permanently. The American Foreign Policy Council noted that before the war, Russia already needed 550,000 migrants per year just to keep its population stable. That was before the front line started swallowing up its workforce. By 2024, the job site Superjob reported that 73% of Russian companies were understaffed. And as recently as April 16th, the governor of Russia's central bank warned that businesses are being forced to offer higher wages to compete for a workforce that simply doesn't exist in sufficient numbers. Higher wages mean higher production costs. Higher production costs mean higher prices. And higher prices mean ordinary Russians are being quietly crushed, while Putin calls his 2.1% unemployment rate a highlight. Now let's talk about where Russia's economy is actually breaking down in real time, because this is the part that changes the picture entirely. Russia's central bank uses something called the business climate indicator. Any number above 0 means growth. Any number below 0 means contraction. In January, it sat at 0.2. By February, it had dropped to minus 0.1. In the same period, the central bank recorded a sharp decline in business revenues across most of Russia's industries, and that decline worsened with each passing month. Construction output fell 16% year-on-year in January and another 14% in February. Manufacturing fell 2.9% year-on-year across the first 2 months of 2026. Russia's cargo transport volume in February dropped to its lowest level since 2020, the height of the COVID-19 pandemic. Retail trade is stagnant. Wage growth slowed from 13.5% in 2025 to just 8% in February. And in response to all of this, factories across Russia have started cutting to 3-day work weeks. Kartex, a mining excavator plant, placed 38% of its staff on reduced hours. 8 enterprises halted production entirely. 16 more cut their schedules. AvtoVAZ and KAMAZ, Russia's 2 largest vehicle manufacturers, halted production and cut working hours respectively. And back in November, the tank manufacturer Uralvagonzavod announced mass layoffs that cut staffing in some units by 50%. A tank factory, laying off half its workers in the middle of a war. Russia's federal budget is now reflecting all of this damage. Non-energy tax revenues rose by roughly 7% in the first quarter of 2026, but federal expenditures jumped 17%. The result is a budget deficit of approximately 4.58 trillion rubles, around $60 billion, at a time when Russia is simultaneously spending hundreds of billions prosecuting a war. And that brings us to the one sector that has kept Russia afloat through all of this: oil and gas. Energy typically accounts for between 30 and 50% of Russia's federal budget revenues and roughly 20% of its entire GDP. So when energy falters, everything falters. In the first quarter of 2026, Russia's Ministry of Finance confirmed that total budget revenues were 8.2% lower than the same period in 2025. Oil and gas revenues specifically were down 45.4%. Russia has already been forced to suspend gold and foreign currency transactions until July 1st as a direct result. There is one temporary lifeline. The U.S. military operation against Iran triggered a blockade of the Strait of Hormuz, a waterway through which approximately 20% of the world's oil and liquefied natural gas flows every year. That disruption sent oil prices surging toward $100 per barrel. Even selling at a discount through its shadow fleet, Russia has been cashing in. Reuters reported on April 9th that Russia's main oil tax revenue would double to $9 billion in April alone. But this is a bandage on a bullet wound. If any agreement between the U.S. and Iran reopens Hormuz, prices drop and Russia loses that cushion instantly. The Russian think tank Gazprombank estimates that even with elevated oil prices, Russia's total economic growth for 2026 would only reach 1.3% in the most optimistic scenario. And all current indicators suggest 2026 is more likely to be a recession year than a recovery year. Putin called for solutions at that meeting. The irony is complete. The man who caused every single one of these problems is now demanding that other people solve them. Interest rates inside Russia remain elevated, and the central bank has signaled no significant cuts are coming. Business investment fell 2.3% in 2025, and Russia's Ministry of Economic Development expects another decline in 2026. The only investments being made into Russian companies are coming from those companies themselves, meaning the moment their revenues dry up, the investment stops too. There is no outside capital flowing in. There is no recovery mechanism being built. There is only a slower and slower bleed. And here is the part that even the ceasefire optimists need to hear. 2 analysts, Vasily Burov of the Stratolab consulting firm and Andrei Yakov, an associate researcher at Harvard University's Davis Center, published a piece in the Moscow Times arguing that Russia's economic decay started long before 2022. Putin spent years concentrating wealth among regional elites, Kremlin insiders, and politically connected businesses. Infrastructure was chronically underfunded. Social services were hollowed out. The regions outside Moscow were deliberately kept poor, which, as the authors note, conveniently gave Putin a steady stream of military recruits. The war didn't create these inequalities. It exposed them, amplified them, made them impossible to ignore. If a ceasefire happened tomorrow, none of that changes. The wealth stays concentrated at the top. The poverty stays distributed across the rest. The labor shortage doesn't reverse. The factories don't reopen. The investment doesn't return. The only thing a ceasefire does is stop the bleeding on one front while the internal hemorrhage continues uninterrupted. There is no economist in Russia who can fix what Putin has built, because what Putin has built isn't a broken system. It's a system that is working exactly as he designed it. Enrich the few, extract from the many, and recruit the desperate. The solution that no Russian official will ever say out loud is that Russia cannot begin to recover until Putin is gone. That isn't a political opinion. It is the logical conclusion of every data point we've walked through today. And since Putin isn't going anywhere voluntarily, what we are watching is not a country stumbling toward reform. We are watching a country being slowly hollowed out from the inside while its leader stands at a podium and blames the calendar. If this analysis gave you something the mainstream coverage didn't, share it with someone who needs to see the full picture. Drop your thoughts in the comments. Do you think Russia's economy can survive Putin, or has the damage already gone too far? We read every single one. And if you're not subscribed yet, this is what we do every day. Real numbers, real consequences, no spin.